Hi, Mrs. Ortega here. We are going to take a look today at Chapter 10, which covers gas exchange. So starting out in 1965, the first warning label appeared on cigarettes, and this was a surprise to many people. Back in those days, it was thought to be a harmless pleasure and activity to do. But now it is the leading cause of preventable disease and death in the United States. It's known to cause lung cancer, heart disease, emphysema, and complicate pregnancy. So here our introduction shows the health risks of smoking have been linked to the thousands of substances in tobacco smoke, including nicotine, tar, carbon monoxide, and other dozens of chemicals are known to cause cancer or carcinogens. So when e-cigarettes came out in the market in 2007, many thought these to be a safer alternative to the traditional cigarette. But currently it's a rising activity in youth population, and it's also been known to cause severe respiratory disease. The flavoring liquids that have chemicals in them, as well as the vaporizing nature of the e-cigarettes. And so as we are introduced into this chapter through smoking, we'll take a look at how there are mechanisms of gas exchange with the environment. We'll look at the human respiratory system, and then lastly, transport of gases in the human body. So mechanisms of gas exchange. How do organisms, animals exchange gas with the environment? And so gas exchange is defined as the interchange of oxygen, O2, and carbon dioxide, CO2, between an organism and its environment. And so this provides oxygen for cellular respiration and removes the waste product of carbon dioxide. And so to have gas exchange in humans, it involves 3 steps. First is breathing, the inhalation of oxygen, atmospheric oxygen, then transporting of gases by the circulatory system, and then lastly exchanging gases with each individual body cell. So it goes from taking it all in to getting it to every cell, as they need to take up oxygen from the blood and release their waste product of carbon dioxide back to the blood. And so you can see that in this next image here. The breathing step is inhaling atmospheric oxygen and then exhaling the waste product of carbon dioxide. We use our lungs to breathe, our organ for gas exchange. And so from there, the transport of gases is done by the circulatory system. So in conjunction with the lungs, the circulatory system will receive the oxygen and then receive carbon dioxide as a waste product and exchange it with the lungs. And then from the circulatory system, it goes to every single body cell that will then need those gases of oxygen for cellular respiration, which is done by the mitochondria of the cell. And then the production of carbon dioxide is the waste product, and that will have to be removed, and so that has to go back to the circulatory system and then out of the lungs. And so you can see all the steps here, starting with the beginning to the end. You're getting oxygen to all the cells, and you're removing carbon dioxide from all the cells. Right. So in terms of the surface where it exchanges gases, those respiratory surface must be thin and moist for the diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide to occur. If you remember from Biology 1, looking at membrane transport, Oxygen and carbon dioxide can pass through the phospholipid bilayer of the cell membrane on its own. And so to do that quickly, the cell must be thin. And so the squamous cell that we learned from the previous chapter is going to be the one that you'll see on respiratory surfaces. The squamous cell is going to be the one that you'll see on the respiratory surfaces. And so some animals will use their entire skin as a gas exchange organ. Others will use gills, what we call a tracheal system or lungs. And so we'll look at some examples of different respiratory surfaces. The first one is the earthworm, and it uses its skin as its respiratory surface. And so you can see here in the crosscut of the earthworm, the outer skin highlighted in that bright yellow is going to be where the respiratory exchange occurs. And so from there, it has to go to the capillaries that are on the right underneath the respiratory surface. And so that's right underneath the skin. You'll see the capillaries that are going to be exchanging those gases with the with the respiratory surface and into the environment. So here you can see carbon dioxide go out and oxygen go in. And as oxygen goes in, it makes oxygen-rich blood, which we highlight in our book as red. And oxygen-poor blood is going to be in blue. And so here, note that for the earthworm, the whole body has to stay moist. And so that's why you find them in generally moist areas. For the earthworm itself, you find them underground, so that coincides with the need to be in a moist environment. And so they're also generally small, long, and thinned or flattened for a high surface to volume ratio. That way the exchange, it can get to all cells quickly. Because if you have a bigger animal trying to exchange gas with their skin, not all the cells in the interior most part of the body would get that as quickly. All right, taking a look at gills. So gills are found commonly in fish. Here we define them as extensions of the body's surface. So they're projecting out, in this case, from the body of the animal here, and that they're going to exchange the gas from the environment with these projections that are coming outward from the body. And so here you can see gills. We'll look at this in a little bit more detail at how they have extensions, projections that will have capillaries that will help with exchanging those gases. Then we have insects. Insects have a unique system called the tracheal system. This tracheal system consists of air tubes that extend throughout the body. So it's similar to our lungs, except it's throughout the whole body, and it does not connect to a circulatory system. And so they exchange gases through gases entering and exiting, and this can be done through the tiny tubes with the special thin moisted epithelium, those special cells on the ends of those tubes. And then some others we'll see that have air sacs that allow for better exchange for large organs. But it's unique in that it has no assistance from the circulatory system whatsoever. And lastly, lungs. Lungs are the last respiratory structure we'll see in this chapter, and that they are enfoldings of thin-walled sacs. So these are interior in the animal. And so those you can see are very similar to the rest, that they have lined with the circulatory system to exchange those gases quickly. And so a challenge here is that the moisture needs to be kept inside the body, which is better than outside the body for a land animal. But they do need that daily intake of water to keep the respiratory surface, the lungs in this case, moist. All right, and so we'll look a little bit more at gills and how they're adapted for gas exchange in an aquatic environment. So gills are responsible for absorbing oxygen that's dissolved in water. And so that is a challenge, as there's a lot less oxygen in water than there is in the atmospheric environment. And so there's a lot more oxygen in the air than there is in water. And so in a fish, the gas exchange is going to be enhanced by ventilation, which is the flow of water or air in some other cases, not in fish, but in lungs over the respiratory surface. So the flow of the environment over the respiratory surface is ventilation. And then countercurrent exchange is something that gills and fish will have. This is the transfer of a substance like oxygen between two fluids flowing in opposite directions. And so let's take a look at that a little bit more. Here we can see the fish and its gills in the image here, and it has, in this fish, rayfin fish, is going to have the operculum with gill cover that's not displayed. So you can see the gills here. And then here, looking at the gill structure, there's a main gill arch that goes from, in this case, the eye, near the eye of the fish down to the ventral side of the fish that contains large blood vessels. Obviously, needs to be connected to the circulatory system very well. And so these large blood vessels will form smaller capillaries that go into these projections that are from the gill. And these projections are gill filaments with what we call lamellae. And so that we'll see a little bit more in this next part here. And that each gill filament has different segmentations or like rings, and these are lamellae. And so, or lamella for singular, lamellae for plural. They will be going to have the circulatory system intertwined, and so that's going to have a lot of capillary beds that will then allow for exchange with the environment. And so here we can see, in terms of directional flow, the oxygen rich water, so water is flowing in this case from left to right, but the blood flow from the body is going from right to left. So they're flowing in opposite directions, these two fluids, and so that's essentially countercurrent exchange. They're flowing in opposite directions. And in this case, the function is to exchange gases with the environment. And so that's, because they're opposite directions, is countercurrent exchange. And so looking at the reasoning, why would they flow over in different directions, you might ask? And that's to maximize the amount of oxygen that they can get from the water. And so if you look at percentages and numbers here in the bottom picture, you can see starting out in the water, the percent of oxygen is going to be the highest it can possibly be. In terms of fresh water is going to have a certain amount of oxygen, and so that, for simplicity's sake, we'll label it's 100%. It has the maximum amount of oxygen per volume of water that it can. And so as it goes across the lamella here, the lamella is going to take that oxygen, so it's going to decrease in percent as it goes across. And so if you remember from BIOL 1, diffusion and osmosis of so diffusion, movement of solutes, osmosis, movement of water will occur from a higher region to a lower region until it equals out. And so here, it's going to keep going all the way across until it reaches the end of the lamella. It's going to keep exchanging because there's always going to be more oxygen in the water than in the circulatory system. And so that's how this works really well. If you look at the circulatory system starting out in on the right side here where the flow starts, it has very, very little oxygen compared to the 15% of oxygen in the water. There's still going to be oxygen moving in to the circulatory system there. And so if you keep looking, it's going to increase steadily up to about 80% here, and it's still going to be lower than the 100%. And so that's still going to be taking in oxygen at that point too. And so that's why this works so well. If it was not like this, if they're flowing in the same direction, it would still start out the same numbers, right? But eventually it's going to reach 50 on this side and 50 on this side, and it's going to stop about halfway through. And so you only use about half of that lamellae, and then it's done. So that's why it does not work to use the same flow direction. And so that's why countercurrent exchange is highly efficient for these fish. And so that's what we answer in this question here. It says, suppose that the blood is flowing in the same direction. What would be the maximum percentage? It would be 50%, because at 50%, both of the levels are equal, and then the oxygen stops moving because it moves from a higher to a lower concentration. And so if the concentrations are equal, it's not going to move anymore. All right, so that's the gills of the fish. Now we're going to look a little bit more at the tracheal system. So the tracheal system of insects is one of the not as well known respiratory exchange surfaces, but it's still very interesting and very unique. And so there are two advantages to breathing air in the tracheal system of the insects as compared to gills of the fish, and that air contains a much higher concentration of oxygen than water does, and air is much lighter and easier to move than water. And so here you can see animals breathing air will spend less energy than those in water because they're not having to work as much to get the same amount of oxygen. They're going to be using less energy. But there are challenges of keeping that respiratory surface moist for the exchange, and so there's a need for water there at that respiratory surface. And so looking at the tracheal system of insects, they have a system of branching tubes that go inside the body that exchange gas on their own without the circulatory system. And so how it does this is it transports oxygen directly to the body cell. It moves carbon dioxide away from them, and this process greatly reduces evaporative water loss, as it's occurring inside the body and not on the skin or out on projections out of the body. And so the largest of the tubes of the tracheal system are called tracheae, and they will connect to external openings that are spaced out along the body. So let's take a look at that. And so here we can see a nice example of a grasshopper, and that it has these tracheae, which are those two projections are going to then go to the external openings. And so those openings are along the body here. And so there are tiny little holes along the body. So you might have seen these on insects before. And so if you're ever wondering what those are their gas exchange surfaces are part of. And so looking at these openings, you can see they have, it's a ring like a valve-like ring. It's going to bring in oxygen and take out carbon dioxide. That's going to lead to the trachea, which will then lead to smaller branches called tracheoles, and then eventually to respiratory surface highlighted in blue there. That will either go to body cells and exchange those gases with the body cells directly. For large organs, they will have air sacs that are surrounding or near those organs. That way, all of those cells in that organ can easily get the oxygen and carbon dioxide exchanged quickly. And so that is a large surface for respiratory exchange. So a little bit about the valves that you see. Those valves have hairs around them along with their ring, so they can kind of open and close slightly to conserve water loss. Their rings are made up of chitin, which is also found in the exoskeleton of the insects. So it's a strong, durable material. And so looking at how the gases move, you might ask. Some of them will move with the body of the animal to help move the gases quickly. Here in these examples, a caterpillar in the top left. These are small, slow-moving insects, and so the diffusion through the tracheae is enough. They don't need any additional help, assistance for gas exchange. But more active insects like the grasshopper in the bottom right picture, and that's in flight, his body movement will help compress and expand those air tubes, and so that will help get those gases exchanging more quickly to compensate for the high level of activity that the grasshopper is doing there. All right, so in what fundamental way does the process of gas exchange in insects differ from that in both fishes and humans? And so if you think about this question, insects, and comparing it to fish and humans, both fish and humans will use their circulatory system to help with gas exchange, whereas insects do not. Right, and so tying in some evolutionary connections here, the movement from animals from water to land had to facilitate a new gas exchange mechanism of breathing water to breathing air. And so that's a pivotal milestone in the history of life. And so here we see in the next image some skeletal adaptations of air-breathing fish. And so the tiktaalik is the example that we'll see here. So you can see the fossil, the tiktaalik, and its reconstruction hypothesis of what it may have looked like. And so at this stage, it is believed that this fish was able to breathe both with water and in air. So it had both gills and some sort of lung-like structure to breathe air. And so it would be able to push itself out of the water with its four fins and breathe air with the structure with its mouth. And so while these things are important, we won't need to focus on them for the test. So. All right, so let's now take a look at the human respiratory system and how we exchange gases with the lungs. And so to understand the lungs, you also have to understand other components of the human body. And so one of those is called the diaphragm. Those musicians out there are probably very familiar with the diaphragm and how using your diaphragm will help with singing. But for those that are not musically inclined, the diaphragm is going to be a tissue and muscle that's going to separate the abdominal cavity from the thoracic cavity, essentially between the lungs and the abdomen cavity. And so this will help actually move and ventilate the lungs. And so the structure is very, very important. And so in terms of cavities, our body is divided into regions that are aligned and held together. So the thoracic cavity is going to be the chest cavity that has the lungs and the rib cage. The abdominal cavity will have like the stomach, liver, and other organs like the digestive system. So the diaphragm separates those two. It's very important to breathing, so we'll see. But in the starting point of breathing for mammals, the air is inhaled through the nostrils or through the mouth. And for the nostrils, it'll go into the nasal cavity where it's filtered by hairs, mucous surfaces, is warmed and humidified, and sampled for odors. So breathing through the mouth will skip the nasal cavity, and so it skips some of those processes of sampling for odors and being filtered, warmed, and humidified. And so from there, the inhaled air will then pass to the pharynx region, then to the larynx, then to the trachea. From the trachea, it goes down tubes to the called the bronchi, and then to the bronchioles, and then to the lastly to the alveoli. And so on the alveoli, that's where the gas exchange will occur. And so these alveoli are very, very thin-walled sacs, and they would be easily collapsible without any help. And so the help is actually a secretion that's called surfactant. This will prevent those moist surfaces from collapsing on itself due to the heavy density of water and other things. And so that's what keeps our alveoli in the correct shape and performing its function. In terms of cells, for the respiratory system, we'll see this squamous cells are going to be for exchange, but other cells that lead to the lungs will have mucus and cilia that will help protect it. And so the cilia will be those hair-like extensions that'll help move foreign particles out of the lungs along with mucus. Other things that we'll want to look at are the larynx. The larynx is also commonly called the voice box. It has a pair of vocal cords that will produce sound with exhaling air. So high-pitched sounds are made from tight, fast vibrations of these vocal cords. Low-pitched sounds are from more relaxed, slow vibrations. And in terms of surfactants, we'll see at the very end of this chapter a little bit about fetal development, but for now we'll take a look that surfactant production happens at the very late stage of fetal development. So any baby born 6 weeks early or more may not have these surfactants, and so without them, their lungs will essentially collapse, and so as a result, they will not be able to survive. And so to combat that, scientists have come up with artificial surfactants that can be administered through breathing tubes that allow for these alveoli to maintain their shape until the baby is able to produce the surfactants on its own. So let's take a look at the structures here. So at the top there, you can see the nasal cavity that will lead to the pharynx, which you can also see has the esophagus, which will lead to the digestive system. But for breathing, it will go to the larynx, where your voice boxes, your vocal cords are. And then from the larynx goes down to the trachea, which is the long, very thick tube that's going to be supported by rings of cartilage. And then those branch into bronchi, or bronchus for singular. And so each bronchus goes to a lung, left and right lung. And from there, they have bronchioles that branch off. And from bronchioles, you'll have eventually alveoli. So in terms of pollutants and keeping the lungs clean, exposure to pollutants can lead to many different things, one of which is the chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD for short. This is where the ventilation and gas exchange is severely impaired. And so as a result, many people have shortness of breath, difficulty breathing, and other symptoms that can be treated with medication. And so here shows you the details of the alveoli. So at the very end of those bronchioles, you'll have these air sacs called alveoli. And on these alveoli, they'll have capillaries. These capillaries are very, very tiny, as you can see, spread throughout all the air sacs in order to exchange gases effectively and quickly. Right, in terms of going back to that introduction, how cigarette smoking is hazardous to your health. So before, and then, when cigarettes came out, it was seen as a daily activity that was for pleasure. And so nowadays we know that many things inside the cigarettes can cause much harm to your health. And so it can cause lung cancer and other respiratory diseases. And so you can see that study here, one of many studies of death rate per 100,000 people in the year due to cancers of the respiratory system drastically has been increasing. And so this is one of the top leading preventable cause-related death in the United States. So while these things are very important, it's not something you need to memorize for the exam. So now let's take a look at breathing in terms of exchanging gases with the environment with our lungs. The breathing is the ventilation, so the flow of air into and out of the respiratory system is ventilation. And so breathing is ventilation of the lungs through alternating inhaling and exhaling. And so for humans and some other mammals, this ventilation occurs by a process we call negative pressure breathing, in which the air is being pulled into the lungs. And so negative pressure, if you're wondering what that means, is moving from a higher to a lower pressure. So the air is moving from a higher pressure to a lower pressure, and that's bringing it into the lungs. And so the overall process is pretty simple in that the contraction of the rib muscles and also the diaphragm will expand or increase the size of the thoracic cavity, i.e. the lungs. And then that expansion of space, it reduces the air pressure. And so this will draw air into the lungs. So let's take a look at that. And so the inhalation phase, you see on the left, first air has to be inhaled. And so to inhale air, we're going to increase the space of which our lungs can hold the air. And so as you increase the space, the rib cage will contract, those muscles will tighten and pull those up and out. So kind of like pulling up blinds, each of those pieces of blind is moving upwards. Our ribs will move upwards and outwards as well. And so that is one component. And so the second component is the diaphragm, the muscle down here, is going to contract. And so as it tightens, it's going to move down. And so it's actually going to move downwards and increase that space. And so then all the air, at this point, the pressure inside the lungs is lower than the pressure in the air. And so air will then naturally go into the lungs. And so in summary, in inhalation, cavity will increase in size, the pressure will decrease, and so air moves in. And so as the exhale portion starts, the diaphragm will relax and move upwards. This movement of upward movement will start to push air out along with the rib cage. It gets smaller as the rib muscles relax. And so as they relax, it goes back down, like the blinds go back down, and then the air gets exhaled. So cavity will decrease in size during exhalation. Pressure will increase inside the lungs. So it will go back to its resting pressure, and then air moves out. And so that's why it's negative pressure breathing. You're doing the work to inhale, and then exhale restores it back to resting status. And so that's why inhalation is an active process, because you're having to contract muscles and expand the thoracic cavity, whereas exhalation is usually passive, and that it's just relaxing muscles. So inhalation, you're contracting muscles. Exhalation, you're relaxing muscles. And so now that we understand how the breathing occurs in the lungs, now we're going to see how it's controlled. So controlling breathing is in the brain. It's done by sensing and responding to the pH of the cerebral spinal fluid, or CSF for short. This is the fluid that surrounds your brain and is in the spinal cord. And it's closely tied to the circulatory system. And so we'll see it's also a response to the circulatory system, which indicates the carbon dioxide level in the blood. And so the drop in blood pH will trigger an increase in the rate and depth of breathing. And so as you exercise, more cells will need oxygen and will be producing carbon dioxide. And so that to compensate for that, you will increase the rate and depth of breathing. And so you might wonder, how does all of that work? CO2, carbon dioxide, will dissolve from the blood. So this will go from the blood to the cerebral spinal fluid, and that is going to detect send the response to the brain that will then detect the change. And so you might also be wondering how carbon dioxide lowers pH. So you remember pH from BIOL 1, a normal neutral pH is 7. Acidic pH goes anywhere from below 7 to 0. And a basic or alkaline pH goes up to 14. And so lowering pH makes it more acidic. Oh, try that again. And raising pH makes it more basic. And so looking at carbon dioxide, is going to, when formed with, binds with water, it's going to form carbonic acid, and that lowers pH. And so that's how the increase in carbon dioxide is going to make a change in the blood that will be detected in the cerebral spinal fluid as well, as it dissolves from the blood to the cerebral spinal fluid. So you can see that here, our normal blood pH is about 7.4, so it's slightly basic. As it falls due to rising levels of carbon dioxide, the medulla is a part of the brain, is going to detect a decrease in the pH of the cerebral spinal fluid, as well as sensors and major blood vessels detect the decrease in blood pH and send that stimulus to the medulla, which will then receive those signals and then signal to the rib muscles and diaphragm to increase the rate and depth of ventilation. As you breathe more and more deeply, the oxygen will increase, the carbon dioxide will decrease, and so that restores the pH back to normal, about 7.4. And so for this portion, you want to understand it's in part of blood pH along with cerebral spinal fluid, and the detection region of the brain is called the medulla. All right, so now that we understand how breathing occurs and the mechanism for breathing, we're going to take a look at transporting of the gases in the human body. And so the blood transports these gases in the body by the heart pumping the blood throughout the whole body. It's going to pump oxygen, poor blood to the lungs, where it picks up oxygen and then drops off carbon dioxide. And so oxygen-rich blood returns to the heart to be pumped to all the body cells, where then it drops off that oxygen and picks up carbon dioxide. And so you can see that here. That the heart pumping twice wants to get the air to, or the circulatory system to the lungs to exchange gases with the lungs, and then to exchange gases with the body cells. There's 4 chambers of the heart, 2 of which to temporarily store blood on the top, and then 2 to pump blood on the bottom. We'll see the circulatory system next chapter, and so we'll look at those structures more. But overall, the idea here that is pumping blood to the lungs and then to the body to exchange gases, that's the important idea here. And so looking at gases, in the air, there's a mixture of gases, and each of those gases exerts a pressure. And so each kind of gas in the mixture accounts for a portion of the total pressure. And so that's called a partial pressure. And so using partial pressure, molecules of gas will diffuse down their gradient, moving from where they're more localized, so higher pressure, to those of lower pressure. And so you can think of this just like you would think of diffusion, movement of solutes from where they're higher concentration to where there's a lower concentration. The same thing happens with gases, except it's called partial pressure, as they're not in the same form as the solutes. And so here is just note that the oxygen gas will move from where there's more oxygen gas to where there's less oxygen gas. And it doesn't matter what carbon dioxide is doing. It's going, each gas is going to move based on its own percentage, its own concentration. And so the carbon dioxide gas will move based on its region of where there's more carbon dioxide to where there's less carbon dioxide. And so that's a very big part of the circulatory system, is those percentages and those concentrations are going to need to be in the correct orientation. That way they move where they need to go. So more carbon dioxide waste is being produced by the cells, and less is in the blood, and so it's going to move into the blood. And so that functioning is very, very important for not only gas exchange, but the circulatory system. All right, and so looking at the blood itself and how it transports these gases is done through a structure called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin will carry oxygen as well as carbon dioxide, and it's also going to buffer the blood. And so most animals transport oxygen bound to protein called respiratory pigments. And for us, it's a red pigment that contains iron, and it's called hemoglobin. It is used by most vertebrates and many invertebrates. It transports oxygen and carbon dioxide and buffers blood. But for other animals, there's a blue copper containing pigment that's used by mollusks and arthropods that we won't explore here, but just you can understand there are more than one type of pigment to carry gases in the blood. And so here you can see the hemoglobin molecule. So this molecule is the whole entire thing that you see here. That's hemoglobin. And looking at the hemoglobin molecule, there's 4 subunits that are shown in different colors of purple. So there's 2 subunits in dark purple, 2 in light purple. And then they also have these molecules called heme. There's 4 of them, and each heme molecule has an iron mineral there. And so that iron is very essential. It's going to bind the oxygen. And so for each hemoglobin molecule, it combines 4 molecules of oxygen. And so looking at hemoglobin and comparing and adding, in addition to that, how babies are going to attract this oxygen more frequently. So the fetal hemoglobin version is going to actually attract oxygen more strongly than adult hemoglobin. And so this will enhance oxygen transfer from the maternal blood into the placenta, and it's going to be very beneficial for the baby, as it's never going to, under normal circumstances, be at a loss for oxygen. It's always going to get the oxygen it needs, no matter what. And so even if the mother is not in the best of health, the baby is always going to get the oxygen it needs due to that fetal hemoglobin. And so at birth, this rising carbon dioxide in the fetal blood will stimulate the breathing control center in the medulla to initiate breathing. And so that is a pivotal point of where the baby is going from breathing in fluid to breathing in air. And so it's an interesting aspect of how does that happen, and it's due to the carbon dioxide in the blood stimulating the medulla control center to initiate breathing. And so if you wanted to see the development, the aspects of this in a diagram form, you can see here the baby is surrounded by fluid, amniotic fluid. The placenta is going to contain blood vessels from the mother and fetal capillaries, so that's where exchange occurs between the mother and the baby here. And that's through the umbilical cord. And so that aspect is very important for birth, along with and tying in our illustration from the beginning of this chapter, smoking and how it complicates pregnancy. Smoking will actually reduce the oxygen supply to the placenta by as much as 25%, which is very significant. This can result in premature birth, a low birth weight, and other brain and lung defects. So it's very, very serious, as any expectant mother should stop smoking if they are currently smoking, and that does include vaping. And so as we end this chapter, I hope you have learned and understand now the mechanisms of gas exchange. And if you have questions, let me know. Do keep in mind the review is for this chapter, I believe, is very well in terms of pointing out what to know. As we've reviewed all the concepts here, I've told you some pages that are slides that are essentially not, or definitely not on the exam, but the concepts here are hard to point out, as you know, we have to explain them. So most of the slides are going to be slides you want to study. So keep that in mind. Bye for now. See you next time.